What is the status of the Pacers roster battle, plus the other moves that they have to make before the season starts, and so much more on today's Locked On Pacers, like the Grizzlies tonight, a tough test, Herb Simon's in the Hall of Fame, and so much more. We have so much to discuss. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Monday. Hope you had a great weekend, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today, so much to get to. The Pacers play tonight again. They play the Grizzlies, another tough test. At least the projection of the Grizzlies would be a tough test. Their star players present unique challenges. Lots to dive into with that game. We have some news updates we have to run through. Herb Simon, Hall of Famer. Johnny Furphy is hurt and probably not going to play this week. Almost certainly not going to play this week. Plenty more on that front. The Mad Ants making moves. And yet, none of that is where we're going to start, because this episode's coming out October 14th, which means we are very close to lots of deadlines coming up. About a week away from when the cap hits start counting. It's real. If you're on the team, you are charged against the salary cap. Your roster has to be at a certain size. The last day for rookie extensions is coming up. All sorts of very important deadlines. And teams are at the last stages of figuring out what that's all going to look like. Pacers have 2 more games to really evaluate all this stuff and figure out how they're going to do all this. So we're going to start with the roster stuff. We're going to go to the Grizzlies, and we'll end with big news. And the roster stuff starts with the battle. Right, I wrote about this a little bit just to include Rick Carlisle's specific quotes and thoughts, but the Pacers, for only, I think, the second time since Carlisle was hired as the coach, truly have a back end of the roster battle or have extra guys in camp. David Dastarvitas was an extra guy in camp. At the time, it looked like he might be in a battle for a 2-way spot, and then Trevelin Queen sprung free from Philly. That was another extra camp year, but usually right about the right number of guys in camp for the Pacers. This year, they have won over, right? Clearly, there's some kind of battle for the final roster spot. Kendall Brown's fully non-guaranteed. Cole Swider's fully non-guaranteed. Everybody knows that detail with their contracts, meaning they carry no cap hit if they're waived before the season, and then it's per day. They could be waived anytime with very minimal penalty. And so they are fighting to make the team. The Pacers can afford it with any tax concerns to keep either one of them. They also have lightly guaranteed deals elsewhere, and there's a lot more to this that we'll get to in a second. But Rick Carlisle mentioned it, right? He was talking about Cole Swider, and he said he's a guy competing for the 15th spot. Like, he offered up that there is some sort of competition there. And he said he wants to see the guys compete for it. He says how they compete, how they manage game situations when they have chances to play. That stood out to me as very interesting. And a big part of this that will matter, right, is they're trying to win, and guys who can come in and see the situation and figure out how they can have an impact, even if they may not be as skilled or have as high of potential. That is a big thing. That's going to matter a great deal in this process. And later he said, whether it's him, referring to Cole Swider, this is Rick Carlisle talking, whether it's him, whether it's Kendall, or whether it's one of the guys that's presently on a 2-way deal, that's kind of where it is. That was him referring to the final roster spot. He said, I'm anxious to see how those guys compete. So let's digest that and what we've seen so far, right? First of all, not noted in that quote, and I would have assumed these guys were on the team anyway, was James Wiseman or James Johnson, who do not have fully guaranteed contracts, but do have guaranteed money. I mean, come on. Like, if you followed this podcast all summer, or followed the team all summer, or followed the NBA for more than 2 years, you knew those guys were pretty much safe no matter what. Anyway, Wiseman's their third center. James Johnson is as valuable as it gets when it comes to just pure vets on a roster. They're going to make it. They're not fully guaranteed, so I bring them up in this discussion sometimes, but they're going to make it, right? So really what happens with spot 15 is the 3 things he just said, and I want to get into this. Cole Swider, Kendall Brown, and a 2-way slot. Or a 2-way slot, potentially. And I'll talk about that in a second, because I think that's an interesting part of what he said. So if you just right now made me tell you what I think the real situation is Cole Swider or Kendall Brown's going to get the spot. And I'll talk about Enrique Freeman in a second. But their salary situation is set up so that if they keep the more expensive of those 2 players, which by the smallest smidgen is Kendall Brown, they still are cozy in their luxury tax position, right? So they have no financial considerations, at least in the worst case scenario of this. So they really are deciding on the basketball players. And right now, if you've been watching preseason, it's clear who they have ahead to me. Cole Swider is playing much earlier in these games. He got in the third quarter in the Cleveland game. He's playing with like not deep reserve groups. He's playing with some guys who will actually play in the rotation this coming season. And he didn't play very well in Cleveland. He missed a bunch of shots, but in Atlanta, he made a good amount of shots and led the team in rebounding, I believe, with his 6. Like, he did interesting stuff and has shown me more off the dribble than I expected in these games. But regardless of what he's shown on the court, we could totally ignore that for a second. Just the fact that rotationally, and maybe I'm reading too much into a preseason rotation, I can accept that that's potentially a misguided way of looking at it. But just on that, I would say it looks like Cole Swider's ahead. In fact, I said this at the time. You can go back to August and listen. My theory was the fact that they signed Cole Swider at all almost suggests that he's ahead of Kendall Brown. They didn't have to do that. They had a team. They had 15 guys already. And they said, no, we want to try something else. We might want to try something else. And this was not long after Kendall Brown did not have a good summer league, right? Which augured the discussion of like, hey, is this really what they want to do this year? His deal is fully non-guaranteed. And you can also recall, if you listened around summer league, I said, hey, yes, he's not playing well, but because his deal does not become guaranteed till opening night, that gives the Pacers time to do exactly what they're doing. Have a roster battle. Let Kendall Brown come to camp, see if he looks awesome, see if he does some good stuff. He didn't miss a shot in Cleveland. He made some nice plays in that game, right? If he continues to develop, if he looks better, then he could get the last spot, right? So if you asked me to say right now, who's been better? I would say Cole Swider has been better. I would also say that to me, the utility of a guy who can shoot, or at least projects to be someone who can shoot, is higher than that of a really athletic 21-year-old who hasn't shown as much skill elsewhere, although Kendall Brown's certainly still developing in his skill on both ends, defender, shooter a little bit. And so if Brown has a really eye-popping game, that would obviously change the perspective of that. But I think the specialist in one skill type is more what a team like the Pacers, who are now in let's win as much as we can mode, need, as opposed to the maybe this guy becomes something that can help us win guy. But I don't know. They're both 2A eligible, which I'll get to in a second. But if you made me decide right now what I thought the Pacers were thinking, I would be guessing that they think Swider gets spot 15, but it's not guaranteed that he keeps it all season, right? They'll reassess come January. We'll talk about that in a second too. Then Brown has a lot to prove this week not a lot, but some to prove this week to potentially leapfrog him. And Rick said they could keep nobody, which is another thing we'll get to in just a second. So the other thing he mentioned in his quote that I just said and want to get to is the part about the 2A guys, right? And how they are in this kind of orbit of what we're discussing, right? Or he said, remember, whether it's one of the guys that's presently on a 2-way deal. So that is Enrique Freeman, Tristan Newton, and Quentin Jackson. If you remember, Newton and Jackson were signed on the same day to 2-way deals. Then a couple weeks later, in comes Freeman. My theory, still a theory, was that was done because they were considering a standard roster spot for Freeman. Now, doing so in August would have basically made it obvious they were not keeping Kendall Brown because they're not going to cut a draft pick. So the 2-way route makes sense. But, I mean, if we're being real, if you just ranked the best 15 players we've seen from the Pacers from the start of Summer League till right now, Enrique Freeman's in the top 15, right? That's technically a standard roster spot player, and he would be deserving of that on merit alone. Now, he is already signed to a contract, right? They don't have to. Like, people will say, oh, should they convert Enrique and promote him? Like, yeah, I guess there is some cap value to doing so, but he's on a contract right now. If they want Enrique Freeman to play with the Pacers because they really believe in him, they could just do that, right? So the tangible benefit of doing so would be to either get someone else on a 2-way or for the cap savings, and there's not a lot of that. The other thing that matters is if you don't have 15 guys on your team, you're allowed to have 14. Really, you're allowed to have 13 for small amounts of time. If you don't have 15, the way that your 2-way contract games played is counted different. It's a group number for all 3 guys instead of just per player. So there are actual benefits to carrying 15 guys. So if they convert Freeman, they would like to have another 2-way player. And if they don't convert Freeman, they probably would maybe want to keep those guys if they wanted to maximize those chances. Although they're so deep, that might not matter. Just another piece of consideration. So on one hand, yes, I understand. Hey, Freeman has been the best of anyone, really, who's in this kind of flux below the standard guys. But he's already on a contract. He has a 2-way right now. If he keeps playing well and it shows like, hey, I'm better than these guys, in January 7th, when contracts become guaranteed, if players aren't waived, they could say, hey, you know what? January 7th, we're going to waive someone at the back of our roster, promote Enrique Freeman then, and then figure out the two ways. Or they could do it by the two-way deadline, like they did last year in early March with Kendall Brown. Just because they don't do something now means they're never going to. And they already have him under contract. And if they have 15 guys, it's 50 games. It's over 50 games of Enrique Freeman they could play, right? They don't need to do that unless he's so exceptionally awesome. And then maybe you just do it now. Now, here's something I wonder. I don't know this. In fact, I would guess that the answer is no. But with Brown and Swider, they are both two-way eligible. It would suck. It would not be fun if they're willing to take it. I mean, are you willing to promote Freeman and then cut one of them and re-sign them to a two-way? Would they want to do that? I don't know. They've both been on two-ways their whole career, basically, except for Brown for the last 2 months of last season. That's a factor I don't know. Only they can answer that question for me. That is technically possible. So as it stands right now, with all the factors at play of the cap dynamics, of how these players have actually played, of what I think the Pacers need, of how the money shakes out, I would guess the last spot would go to Cole Swider if it was decided today. But we'll see. And the fact that they can reassess several times throughout the season, January, March, really anytime, since they're fully non-guaranteed deals. Terry Taylor got promoted in December when he was really balling on a two-way. There's so many ways this could go that I think what they'll do, if I were guessing right now, is that Kendall Brown will get waived at the end of this week unless he has an exceptional preseason outing or exceptional practices, and Cole Swider gets spot 15. We can't see everything. I don't see practices. Perhaps the team views this differently than I do. And then from there, they are constantly evaluating what to do with these back of the roster spots. Now, that's not the only roster thing that we're going to talk about today. One more thing to get to, actually 2 more things to get to regarding rookies. We've talked about this stuff a little bit, but now we have more information. Rookie options, rookie extensions, any changes on that front for the Pacers. We'll get to that in just a moment. Before we do that, we got to talk about the great folks over at FanDuel. NFL fans, Colts fans, what a game. You can keep the season rolling with a big, huge return over on FanDuel. They are America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get that hunch, it's the middle of the game, you feel it, it's time. You can check out the latest stats so you know what's going on. You can view the live play-by-play so you know exactly what and when it's going on and figure out the right timing for everything. And so much more. You can see all that on the same page where you would place your bets. That's exactly what you could want. You can be as formed as you can be when you get that hunch and you want to act on it. And so FanDuel is the best place to do that. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. $200 in bonus bets to operate the way you choose. That is on FanDuel.com. We're back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. Your second listen has to be Locked On Colts. They survived the Flacco experiment. Michael Pittman Jr., what a game. Is he have Jr. in his name? I don't know why I said that. Michael Pittman was awesome. Key touchdown, 3-3, season still alive. Locked On Colts will break it all down. I'm endlessly fascinated by the coverage of the Colts this season. That's a conversation for another day. You guys don't care what I think about the Colts. You're here for the Pacers and Locked On Colts for the Colts. Let's talk about the rest of this roster stuff. Then we'll get to news. Then we'll get to Grizzlies. Change it up the order on the fly here. So beyond that stuff I just said, the other thing that has to be decided before the season starts is rookie extensions. Last year, Aaron Nesmith, right before the season, that one came through the wire. You know, that happens when the season is coming, right? That's when these can get done. Actions and deadlines spur action in the NBA, as Ed has said. Aaron Nesmith agreed on October 23rd last year, right? Like you have until that time to, in theory, do something, but it gets hairy and no fun. That is the last day, is next Monday. So a week from today. The only player applicable on the Pacers is Isaiah Jackson. I've talked about this a little bit. He is extension eligible until that date. I would predict no. I would have predicted no for TJ McConnell extension 2, and he got it. The money doesn't kick in until next year, so it's not a real concern, although for their current season, it's not a real concern, I should say. But it does, eat up what could be space for Turner or something else. So it is a tricky thing for them. Now, if they get a great value that they love, which is now a thing that teams do with like Zeke Naji and Nasir Little and Peyton Pritchard, which is a new trend, perhaps if he was willing to do 3 for 15, I don't know, something in that range. Perhaps that's such a cheap deal for a young ascending guy. The Pacers would do it, but I don't see that being reality. But I don't know. I don't really know what Isaiah Jackson's thinking, what the Pacers are thinking there. They've been willing to extend everybody else, and I think that they know what Isaiah Jackson is. They know what his role is, but seeing just a full season of it where he is occupying that spot as often as possible, no toggling back and forth with someone else, the health status of it all, especially next year with their center position in flux, having as many resources as possible, they could still keep him. He'll be a restricted free agent next summer. Could end up proving to be valuable. So I predict nothing happens. I predicted nothing would happen with TJ McConnell. And then like 2 days later, I was wrong. But the changing cap dynamic with Jackson doesn't really exist since I last talked about this. I guess McConnell's extension does change things a little, but it still point stands Myles Turner and his incoming raise, and then Ben Mathurin's incoming raise. And then, you can keep going, suggest that they probably should be done adding spending for future seasons unless they know they're getting a bargain, a great contract, like McConnell's exceptional contract, right? It's so lightly guaranteed in the back end. You had to do it. If they can get something with Jackson like that, maybe they would do it, but I don't see that being the case for a young player. The other thing that's coming, and I honestly can't believe it hasn't just happened yet, is rookie scale team options, which have to be decided on a full year in advance. So the 2025-26 season for Mathurin, Walker, Shepherd, I think that's it, actually. Those 3 guys all have an team option for that season. They're all good and totally worth the money they would be paid for that year. That press release will come at some point before the end of the month. That doesn't have to be decided before the season. They really have 17 days on that. There's absolutely no reason for the Pacers to not pick that up. So there's no debate. There's nothing to talk about, but that is something that has to happen in the next couple weeks. Congrats to those guys when that option gets picked up on their money. Okay, let's run through some news that I think is important before we talk about the Grizzlies. And of course, the headliner that happened over the weekend, Hall of Fame inductions, enshrinements, whatever the perfect word is, happened up on the East Coast, Northeast Coast. A lot of Pacers representation there, a lot of IU representation there. Herb Simon, Pacers owner, officially a Hall of Famer. Longest tenured owner. You guys know that deal by now. The Pacers have been in Indy since that time. Got nominated in Indy for All-Star Weekend. His enshriners, legendary crew with Reggie and Tamika and Larry. Look, I don't know fan opinion on owners. I will say that he has done a lot for Indy and a lot for the Pacers with stadium upgrades, practice facility upgrades, stuff that actually matters in luring talent to a facility, stuff around the arena, the plaza, the new speakeasy. Really does a lot for Indy. And of course, keeping an NBA team there is a big part of that. Deserved honor, and being the longest tenured anything in a major sports league is a big deal. And he's been owning the Pacers for over 40 years. It's unbelievable. So congrats to him. Congrats to his entire family, who's very much around the Pacers all the time. Well deserved. Well deserved. I hope everybody who was up there had a great time. That's always such a fun weekend. Everybody's just happy and celebrating, and it's a big day. Moving on, not as fun news. Johnny Furphy, the ankle injury. The left ankle is what it was listed for the Hawks game. I think he had injuries to both ankles at one point last week. He's not playing in the preseason. It is a bad enough sprain that's not going to be the case. Rick Carlisle told us that on Sunday. We could see him doing shooting drills. He was shooting pretty well, but not worth getting him out there for game action and risking a chance of re-injury or anything like that. So we will not be seeing Johnny Furphy at all in the preseason. Thankfully, we have Summer League. We've seen him play some. The G League will likely happen a lot this year. I'm looking forward to seeing him play if there's garbage time early in his NBA time before the Mad Ants start, but does not sound like we'll get to see game action from Johnny Furphy until the regular season actually starts. I really enjoyed Kelly Kraftskov's press conference as she became the president of the Indiana Fever, talking about the similarities between Caitlin Clark and Tyrese Haliburton and building around them. And she has the blueprint to do that, right? She just did it with Tyrese. Now it's doing around Caitlin Clark. I would highly recommend watching that press conference. You'll learn a lot about the Fever, and you'll learn a lot about the Pacers from somebody who has worked very, very, very hands-on with both franchises in a very important role. But I thought that was really, really revealing and cool to see that kind of path and blueprint really exists. Some small stuff. Tyrese Haliburton, shoe deal, Puma. According to Nick DiPaolo of ESPN and Boardroom and a bunch of other places, he's a shoe insider. I don't know anything about that stuff, so I have to rely on other people. He's going to be the face of the company with Puma. Very cool for Haliburton. I've seen Johnny Furphy wearing lots of Pumas too, but that's awesome for Tyrese. The announcement video with him and his dad was spectacular. He was wearing Pumas at Fan Jam, and now it makes me look unobservant and stupid that he was wearing that his socks were flipped down and he was wearing non-basketball shoes at media day. But congrats to him. That's very cool. You're gonna see a lot of Puma shoes on Tyrese Haliburton's feet this season and beyond, and lots of other Puma branded things with Tyrese Haliburton. Also, the Mad Ants did some stuff. Their coaching staff is not changing at all, so that doesn't really count as doing stuff. It's exactly the same as last year. Justin Wetzel got promoted to associate head coach, for those who know anything about that staff. And then they made true trades, actually, this month. One was acquiring Landers Nolly. Some of you might remember him from college basketball as recently as last year. He was in the New Orleans Pelicans system. He played in the preseason for them and then was on their G League team. He's currently in Greece, so I kind of doubt he'll actually come to the Mad Ants or the NBA, but he was involved in a trade. Alfred Payton went to the Pelicans. It is what it is. And then they traded for Dakota Mathias's rights much more recently. The Pacers actually signed and waived Mathias last month. So that suggested to me they actually want him in their program and on the Mad Ants, and that he wanted to do that because he signed the contract, obviously. So they had to get his G League rights to actually do that, and they did it. So I'd expect Dakota Mathias to be playing some ball in Indiana again this season, which is pretty cool. I thought he was pretty good in Summer League, as you guys know, if you listen to me talk about it then. They'll still have to do the Jahlil Okafor sign and waive Exhibit 10 at some point. That hasn't happened yet, but anytime the Pacers practice, that could be a thing. Plenty of time for that to happen, and whoever else they decide to potentially work through, because the Mad Ants start in like less than 2 weeks. So lots to sort out there. Let's talk about the Grizzlies and tonight's preseason game, what to watch for from the Pacers. In fact, a lot of the stuff that I hoped to see last game happened. We learned a lot about the Pacers in Cleveland. Now it's a home game in Cambridge, good Western Conference opponent. What can we learn from that game? Let's close out today's show talking about some Grizzlies. We're back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. Your second listen should be Locked On Knicks or Locked On Timberwolves. Why? Obviously, they were involved in a huge trade, but that's not the answer. The reason is they played each other in the preseason on Sunday, and Dante DiVincenzo was talking some ish. It was great. You'll learn a lot from either of those shows about that moment, the new players, the biggest trade right before the season. I'm still telling you to learn more about it because I think it's so fascinating. Let's talk some Grizzlies and some preseason hoops. I hope Ja Morant plays. He's only played one preseason game so far of the 3 for Memphis, and I get he only played 9 games last year, and there's an element of being careful and like, hey, Jaren Jackson's not playing. What are we really getting out of this? He's just so good and fast with the ball. And that kind of player is a really big test for the Pacers, and I want to see how the Pacers can handle it or do better. They struggled with him last year. They were one of the 9 teams that had the misfortune of playing against Ja Morant last season, and it didn't go well, right? So I want to see the Pacers go against someone like that. Trey is obviously elite as a ball handler and can get kind of wherever he wants, but he's not as tall or athletic as Ja, so it's just a little different the way he's guarded, the pressure he puts on the rim. And man, you got remember the Morant dunk over Jalen Smith in Cambridge a few years ago. Like, he's just crazy when he's locked in to what he's doing. Can the Pacers keep him out of the paint? Not sure. They haven't really been able to keep anybody out of the paint. And so what do they do about it? Do they rotate late and force him to pass? Or are they just going to live with it? Are they going to try to coax him into jumpers? He specifically is a guy that there's lots of guys who can drive really well. He specifically is among the peak challenges of that kind of player. Can the Pacers actually do anything about it if he plays? I'll be very curious to see, because they've struggled with much worse drivers than Ja Morant. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that looks like. I want to see some defensive growth from the Pacers. I mean, Rick Carlisle called the Cavs game a wasted opportunity. That first half, especially with the starters playing, I know for the Pacers and not for the Cavs, and the Cavs were winning at halftime. The Pacers did not defend well at all. They were not good at the point of attack. They weren't causing the Cavs any stress, right? Can they at least cause the Grizzlies some stress? Can they force the Grizzlies to react to what they're doing? Even if they get open shots, is it because the Pacers wanted them to take that open shot or coax them into that instead of just, oh, this guy got beat again, now there's an easy basket somewhere else? Any defensive improvement is going to be extremely noteworthy, because I mean, we haven't seen enough from the Pacers this preseason. And I get that, everybody wants to say that they'll be better on defense and yada yada, but given how they ended last season, I thought they might look okay on that end. They have not. They need to show something in that way. The Grizzlies have always been a good possession team, but they don't have Steven Adams anymore. I'm curious how their identity is going to change without being able to dominate the glass. But how will that test of trying to force the Pacers to turn it over and never turning it over themselves and trying to be a good rebounding team with what they have, how will that actually look? And what will that do for the Pacers? They haven't played a team like that yet in the preseason, and I think that's a very different kind of challenge for really any team. Other smaller stuff I'm looking out for. The defense I already talked about, but really the starting fives defense, if I want to get more particular, right? Because that group at least is, even all year, largely, if they had Nembhard, Nesmith, Turner on the floor, regardless of who the other players were, trade deadline or not, post All-Star or not, Siakam or not, that group was generally okay, right? Or like good enough, regardless of who the other two players were. That hasn't, it's preseason. It's preseason, caveats. Preseason hasn't been there yet. It hasn't looked like, oh, okay, this is acceptable or good yet. And so I want to see that particularly the starters come out and look really good on the defensive end. I think that would at least give the Pacers some warm and fuzzy feelings of like, oh, okay, maybe we can be fine enough on the defensive end, because every group's been getting just lit up so far. It has not been a good defensive preseason for the Pacers yet. I'm probably being a little dramatic on this. They defended well in the second half against the Cavs. They had some nice moments against the Hawks, who present some funky lob challenges to the Trae Young, but they want to show more. They've said it, right? I think everybody wants to see them do something, and this is a good test for it, and especially to me, the starting five, because when they mix and match, they can get different types of defenders or size out there, but that'll be particularly important. I want to see how Mathurin and Jarace Walker follow up the games they just had, where they both at the same time were like, hey, remember us, the lottery picks? And everybody does remember them, obviously, but they were really good. What do they look like now? Because Mathurin even said it, right? He was way better in Cleveland than he was in Atlanta. So consistency so big for him this year. Can he do it again? Not even score 25 points. Like, make the right plays and keep it moving and cut. Cutting was so good for him in that game. So that'll be a big thing. And then Jarace Walker's continued development at a different position. And of course, again, he made all his shots in Cleveland. That's not all of it. He was playing well besides that. Can he continue to play well and build off of some successful nights? I want to see how Isaiah Jackson's used. Is that going to be a little different? Because it wasn't weird what they did in Cleveland, just wasn't what I expected, right? He wasn't really with the bench at all. And then he was kind of with the starters for the 5 minutes in the second quarter. And so clearly it was in their top 10 and was their backup center, but also wasn't, because they had the top and Siakam front court at times. There's just a lot of layers to how they used him and how they managed that front court rotation. And I want to see if that was, hey, this guy's returning from injury, this is all we can do, versus, hey, this is actually what, and he did play more in the second half. So it's definitely not that, but this is his actual spot in the rotation, or how we see him with the second unit. His particular sub pattern, I think, will be revealing about how the Pacers feel about him, how they can effectively get who they want on the floor and why not. I want to see this, but I don't think we're going to get it in preseason. Can I just have a few possessions where Nembhard's the only point guard on the floor? I just want to see it. I get it. The Pacers are very, very good with two of Haliburton, Nembhard, and McConnell on the floor, and they should keep doing that. To be clear, I just want to see a few with just Nembhard, not just for my data brain to really get a feel for what's the reality of this. How good could this be, especially with Siakam? Just to really see that, because I'm really high on him. I always have been, and I think he's in for a big year. And if he can be good by himself, that does a lot for the Pacers. Last one player to focus in on for me, Pascal Siakam's defense. And I know I mentioned the starters defense a lot, but I don't think he's defended very well in this preseason. He had to change a lot of his principles and tendencies last year. I think he improved as a defender throughout the season last year with the Pacers. And if he needs to pick up where he was at the end of last year, right? To me, it just hasn't looked the same for him yet. His offensive games look refined. His passings look a lot better, to me at least, than last season. Some of the degree of difficulty on some of his passes has majorly improved. But now I want to see some growth on the other end of the floor, or at least some just solid plays from him. And maybe I'm nitpicking the defense, but the results are what they are. And we'll see more results tonight. Pacers, Grizzlies. You can check out Locked On Grizzlies for their perspective. Zach Edey back in Indiana. That'll be quite the story for lots of people. Looking forward to it. Tomorrow, we'll break it all down right here on this very podcast. What happened, what didn't, what matters. And then they play one more game after that on Thursday. And then it's time for the real ones. So lots to come. TBD on guest planning this week. I've been terrible about this. I've only had 2 in the last 2 weeks. I'm so sorry. Not a lot. It's not a lot going on situation, but it kind of is at the same time. We'll get it sorted out. There'll be people talking Pacers this week, talking preseason action, other sorts of considerations. Hope you guys enjoyed this show. I am on Twitter at Tony R. East, and this podcast is there at Locked On Pacers. The best way to see what I'm talking about and in what segment, right there in that feed. Back tomorrow talking Pacers Grizzlies, what happened, what didn't, what mattered. Till then, everybody have a wonderful day.